The next talk is by Vladimir Bortun, whose talk is titled Hostile Brothers, Intra-capitalist Conflict and the Rise of Right-Wing Populism. Vlad, if you want to share your slides while I'm introducing you so we've got them ready, that would be great. So Vlad is a lecturer in politics at St John's College at the University of Oxford, and he works on political elites, left parties, and transnational politics from a critical perspective. So his book, which was published last year, is titled Crisis, Austerity and Transnational Party Cooperation in Southern Europe, The Radical Left's Lost Decades. So Vlad's work takes a historical materialist approach, so very relevant for the workshop today. He is currently exploring the elite dimension of far-right movements, and in particular looking at the class origin of their most prominent members. He's also published recently on the class origin of MPs in Britain and how this shapes their political outlook and behaviour. So we're really happy to have him here today. So over to you, Vlad.
Thank you so much, Fran, for that introduction. I think it's super important to explore this topic. I think it's still vastly under researched and under discussed from these angles that we are proposing today. Thank you for inviting me because I am new to this topic. Like Fran said, I did my research so far on radical left parties, political elites, class politics, and only now I'm starting this research agenda on the far-right populist parties. But I've been thinking about the class character of this political family for about a decade now, from political perspective. And now I'm trying to also do research on it. And as a political scientist, I've been frustrated by the overemphasis in political science literature on either discourse, what these parties say, how they construct the elite that they claim to oppose, how they construct the people they claim to represent, how they construct the opposition between the two. And also, there is a lot of emphasis on the voters. Who votes for these parties, why, when, where, and so on. And of course, it's very important to know these things. I'm not denying the irrelevance of these topics, but I think they don't provide a full picture of this phenomenon of far-right populism. I don't think we know enough, at least in political science, about the social forces that found these parties, that lead these parties, that fund these parties, and that look to benefit from the rise to power of these parties. So in the political science jargon, we don't know enough about the descriptive and substantive representativity of this political family. And this is what I'm trying to do for the next few years, I hope, in terms of my research. But what is the underlying argument, the underlying hypothesis of this research agenda? It's not original, and it's rooted in a materialist analysis of politics and political economy. The title says hostile brothers. This is an expression used by Marx to describe the capitalists. So they are brothers in relation to other social classes, but they are hostile because they are still competing with each other. There are different fractions of capital with different interests and different policies. They compete over markets, they compete over resources, they compete over state contracts, they compete over many things. Fundamentally, they compete over state power. And like Dorit said, I think what we are witnessing with the rise of right-wing populism is an insurgent coalition of social forces led by certain fractions of capital that have felt sidelined. They felt marginalized in the neoliberal globalized framework of the past 30, 40 years, particularly in semi-peripheral countries like Hungary and Poland, like Dorit showed, but not only. Not only. I would say that last 30, 40 years of neoliberal globalization have produced losers and winners within capitalist classes and between capitalist classes. I would say the transnational capital benefited more than national capital. Finance capital benefited more than industrial manufacture capital. Big business benefited more than small and medium businesses, and so on and so forth. Broadly speaking, of course, there are nuances and exceptions to these trends. And my argument here is that what we are seeing is a social bloc emerging that uses right-wing populism as a political vehicle to represent its class interests. That is, of course, like any social bloc, it's a cross-class coalition of different classes and different class fractions. But the social bloc is always dominated by one particular class and one particular class fraction. And I think that, like Dorit has pointed out, in several cases, this fraction tends to be the national bourgeoisie, that especially in semi-peripheral and peripheral countries felt squeezed and sidelined by the increasing domination of foreign capital and multinational companies and banks and so on. But this includes at the base of the social bloc also other social classes, particularly the petty bourgeoisie, which, as we know, is historically has been the social base, the core of the social base of fascist parties of the past centuries. And I think this is probably one similarity with the far-right populist parties of today. I think the role of the petty bourgeoisie is more important than it has been acknowledged so far. But I don't think this is the full story. I think in other cases, and I will try to hint to that in my preliminary case study of Reform UK party, I think in other cases, in more core countries of European and global capitalism, far-right populist parties can be the political vehicles of hegemonic fractions of capital who fear losing that hegemonic status. Old finance, in the language of Theo and his colleague Marlene Benquet in their book about the sections of finance capital that supported Brexit, fossil fuel industry, big tech, as with Peter Thiel, and so on. So my research agenda would consist of two pillars. One, the political sociology of far-right populism. Who are these people who lead the parties, who stand in elections for these parties, so the rank and file of the middle cadre of these parties, not just the voters, which we know already, but also the party elites. So a sociology of elites of far-right populist parties, and the donors as well. Secondly, the political economy of right-wing populism, which we know more about, and I will show in a second what a brief outline of what I think we know so far, what class interests they promote through their policy making, not just through their discourse in their electoral manifestos, which overall tend to sideline economic issues and focus on other more cultural issues. But in their policy making, they don't sideline economic issues. They are very active policymakers or agenda setters in parliaments when they have power, of course, in government, but even when they are in opposition and they have a significant parliamentary presence. They are shaping the economic agenda. I think we know a bit more about the political economy of far-right populist parties, not enough, partly due to the influence of people like Cas Mude in political science literature, who wrote a famous article in 2007 called It's Not the Economy, Stupid, arguing that it's more the cultural grievances of people that have fueled the rise of far-right populism. Of course, he's partly right. I think there is an overstatement of in the media especially, of the level of support that these parties enjoy among the popular classes, among the working class. But this doesn't mean that there are not economic grievances of the elites, which is what my argument is here. We know that they have transitioned over the past decade or 2 decades from a neoliberal position of anti-welfare towards welfare chauvinism, so welfare but only for the ethnically native population. But they are very heterogeneous when it comes to the role of the state intervention. From east to west of Western Europe, from north to south, there are big differences. I'm focusing on the European space here. But we know more, we have a better picture of what's been happening in Central Eastern Europe. We have Dorit, we have Samuel Rogers in the audience as well. He's just published a book on the Orban regime. Gabor Schering, Cornel Ban, Marek Nacik, they have done, all political economists, if I'm not mistaken, have done pioneering work, I would say, in mapping the class forces and the class character of long-standing right-wing populist regimes in Central Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland and Hungary, which, broadly speaking, of course, with important differences and caveats, tend to favor this rebellious national bourgeoisie that felt they needed to capture state power and they needed political representation. But we don't know much about Western European far-right populist parties. We don't know much about the Italian case. We've had a far-right populist party in power for 2 years now. And as far as I know, we don't have a very clear analysis of the political economy of Brothers of Italy, of the Meloni government. I think this is a significant gap. Slobodian, he focuses maybe more on the US case, but he talks also about the Western European case. He identifies an ultra-Thatcherite, an ultra-neoliberal, Hayekian, Mont-Pelerin society kind of neoliberalism that stands to some extent at odds with the kind of protectionism and limited nationalization that we saw in Poland and Hungary. I think we don't have enough theoretical explanation for this variation across the same, what is presumed to be the same political family. Most political families, social democrats, conservatives, Christian democrats, the radical left, they are eclectic, but they tend to have a relatively coherent view of the role of the state now, of interventionism or lack of interventionism. But this political family is very heterogeneous when it comes to that. And I think we need to look beyond politics to understand why that is the case. We need to look beyond the current approach that I think dominates political science literature, which is the electoral manifesto approach that looks at what parties say, and we need to look more in more depth at what parties do, at their policy-making behavior, their legislative behavior. This is some anecdotal evidence of why that matters, why we should look at legislative behavior and what we might find if we look more systematically at legislative behavior. These are some of the policies in the previous French legislature that Rassemblement National, National Rally, Le Pen's party voted on. It's a list of socio-economic measures that arguably would benefit the ordinary people that this party claims to stand for. And you can see, I think she's not great, but you can see that they abstained or they voted against all of these policies. They voted against the cap on rents. They were not in parliament when there was the vote on raising the minimum wage to 1,600 euros. On raising the wages in line with inflation, they abstained. No, they were absent, sorry. On capping the price on basic goods like medicine, they abstained. On introducing taxes on income over 3 million euros, they voted against. On reintroducing wealth tax, they abstained. On giving free school meals to children, they voted against, and so on and so forth. So I think this gives a picture, a glance into the kind of political economy in terms of actual policy making and legislative behavior that these parties display, and why I think there's a need to uncover that more systematically. In terms of the political sociology of far-right populist parties, we know even less. We don't know enough about, apart from anecdotal evidence about Trump, Nigel Farage, Richard Tice, the leader of AFD, one of the leaders of AFD in Germany, Alice Weidel, she's a former Goldman Sachs director. Guido Crosetto in Italy, co-founder of Brothers of Italy, current Minister of Defense. He's a former chief lobbyist in Confindustria for the domestic arm industry. So I think there are some big anecdotal evidence about, but we don't have systematic. Theo, I think in his article for Jacobin around the elections this year in France, he showed some very interesting ties with big business, with Bolloré, no? One of the richest men in France. The only study that I know of, relatively recent by Mazzoleni and others, shows that in the case of the Swiss People's Party, when they won the federal elections in 2015 in Switzerland, over half of their MPs were heads of small and medium enterprises. So we need to learn more about, I think, the class backgrounds of these people. The class background, I think, matters. It's not just a Marxist projection or conjecture. There is a rich empirical, methodologically sophisticated literature that has emerged over the past decades, started in the US with Lupu and Carnes, that show that there is a causal effect of class background of political elites on the outlook and policy making of political elites. Those who come from a business background before joining parliament or national legislatures tend to favor policy that benefits business. So we don't have virtually, as far as I know, maybe I'm wrong, any research on the donors to far-right populist parties. Again, I did a superficial Google search in Google Scholar. I haven't come across any article that specifically deals with this issue, although there is an abundance of anecdotal evidence regarding who gives money to these parties. And sometimes they are the same people, those who donate and those who lead these parties, as we can see now in the case of Reform UK. It's a work in progress. I'm still collecting the data, but you know, it takes ages to be published these days. So I want to present as soon as possible. I think there are some interesting insights emerging already. So I try to apply what the research agenda I outlined earlier to this case. And I started with their economic policy proposals. I know I said we need to go beyond electoral manifestos, but that's all we have at the moment, because they've just had only 5 MPs elected now, 3 months ago. So there's not much to work with in terms of their actual policy making in parliament. But their economic policy proposals can already give a hint of what kind of class interest they represent. You see a selection of policies from their electoral manifesto in the general election this year. Arguably, only the first one, but at first glance only, and you will see in a second why, only the first policy could be seen as benefiting the poorer people in society, the working class and the people on low incomes, raising income tax from 12,000 to 20,000. So basically, you wouldn't pay any income tax if you would earn less than 20,000. But even if you earn over 20,000, and we will see in a second what that means, you wouldn't pay tax on the first 20,000 you earn. The others, however, are, I think, quite straightforwardly pro-business. Further deregulation, acceleration of NHS privatization, reduction of corporate tax from 25% to 15%, so to the similar levels that we see today in Central and Eastern Europe. Further tax cuts for small and medium enterprises, which is important in the light of my argument about the role of the petty bourgeoisie. Tax breaks for landlords, another important section of the petty bourgeoisie. Withdrawal of unemployment benefits for people on benefits if they refuse 2 job offers, or if they are for more than 4 months on unemployment benefits. And fast tracking licenses for exploration of gas and oil in the North Sea, which is also significant because of the link to fossil fuel industry that will emerge in a second. But just this is just an analysis by a center-left think tank in Britain. They looked at how the benefits of that. Remember the first policy that I mentioned, the raising income tax threshold from 12K to 20K, which on the surface looks like it would benefit the poorest in society. Actually, no, it wouldn't. The distribution of benefits would be disproportionately in favor of the richest households in the UK. So even what looks like a pro-working class or pro-ordinary people policy, it's actually disproportionately beneficial to the rich. Now I looked at the donors as well. It's a very limited sample. I looked at the top 10 biggest donors of Reform UK in the past year or so. The first one is a group that is led by Richard Tice, one of the leaders of the party, who's a very rich man, so he can afford donating to his own political party, which I think is an important feature of many far-right populist parties today. Fiona Cottrell is not necessarily her that is linked to the banking sector. Her son, George Cottrell, works as the personal advisor to Nigel Farage, and he used to be in the banking sector. He worked for JP Morgan, Credit Suisse, and so on. Zia Yusuf worked for Goldman Sachs, and he's now the chairman of the party as well. So third biggest donor, but also chairman of the party. David Lilly comes from investment banking, and Jeremy Hosking as well, asset management, but also fossil fuel. And Theo mentioned Paul Marshall earlier. He donated before this period, but he's clearly a supporter of this party. He also comes from the asset, the hedge fund slash private equity fraction of finance capital. And this is a glance look at the top players in the leadership of the party. Nigel Farage, we know, he said we are the anti-elite party, despite the fact that he worked in the city, he's a multimillionaire, privately educated. His father was a trade banker as well, so he's quite elite, both in terms of class origins and class destination. Richard Tice, which I just mentioned, he said
Vlad,
we're,
sorry
yeah,
to interrupt. I wonder if you could wrap it up in the next minute or so, please, just to make sure we've got time for questions.
oh, okay. I was told that I have half an hour.
Half an hour. Ah, I thought we
Yeah,
were doing 20 minutes for talks too.
Yeah. So as you wish. I mean, it's I would say it's your time, but then if you will have less time for questions if you have just 10 minutes for question if you last half an hour, and so as you
okay. I'll
wish,
Yeah,
rush.
your
I'll
choice.
rush.
Sorry.
I'll take less than. We have Rupert Lowe, who is one of the five MPs, and he's donating all his salary as an MP, but he can't do that because he worked in the city and currently owns a farm. Zia Yusuf, the party chairman, self-described British Muslim patriot. I've already mentioned that he worked for Goldman Sachs. He's a multimillionaire and so on. But I'm highlighting these statements they make about the party that they lead and the kind of performativity they are displaying. And then I looked, and this is the bulk of my data collection actually. I'm looking at all the candidates in the recent elections of Reform UK, 609 candidates. And they have these self-presentations on the website of the party where they talk about themselves, who they are, what they did before in life, what kind of jobs, why they're standing, what kind of policies they want to pursue, what are their priorities, and so on. And I've managed to go through half of them, so around 300. And you can already see here some interesting quotes with their current or previous occupation in brackets. All quite elite occupations that contrast to the kind of ordinariness that they are trying to display, the kind of relatedness to working people and ordinary people they are trying to convey. Uh, I will just mention the last one. I'm an ordinary working class woman who cares. Uh, this is a very senior civil servant who was involved in intergovernmental management of the COVID crisis. Not working class by any definition in terms of her current class location. And this is, I think, one of the more interesting empirical things that I wanted to present today. And then I will just wrap it up. I compared I coded these candidates by their current occupation in terms of the national statistics and analytical classes here in the UK. You can see them on the left in the first column. And then I compared them to the occupations, the prior occupations, the occupations before entering parliament of all the MPs in the previous legislature, 2019-2024. And then I also compared them to the averages in the England and Wales population. It's calculated different from Scotland. So I just have the average percentages for England and Wales population. And I would just focus on two things here. First, that there is a considerably lower share of people coming from the top analytical class, large employers, higher managerial, CEOs of big companies and so on. But it's still a much higher share than in the general population, 54% over 13%, but it's less than the mainstream political elites, so the previous members of the parliament, the previous legislature. But, and also very interesting contrast when it comes to the small employers and the self-employed. It was quite conveniently for me coded in one because by historical definition, it constitutes the petty bourgeoisie. Now, that social class stuck somewhere in between the working class and capital and the bourgeoisie. And we can see a disproportionately high share of people among Reform UK candidates, almost a quarter have this kind of background, as opposed to 0% when it comes to the MPs of the previous legislature and only 11% in the general population. And this is the last slide where I just want to outline a few of the implications of a materialist turn in the study of populism. And again, I'm talking here from a political science perspective. I think in political economy literature, there have been much bigger advances in terms of such a materialist analysis and in terms of mapping the class character of far-right populism. But in political science, this is still lacking. And what I'm trying to do basically is to bridge over all these literatures, political science, political economy, and political sociology. One, I think it matters to show that these parties are not an anti-elite force, but they represent a certain section of the elite against other sections of the elite in struggle for hegemony. Second, I think it can shed light upon other developments, broader developments at the base of our political age in terms of intra and inter-capitalist rivalry. Third, I think from a political science perspective, it's something I've been working on when I did work on radical left parties. I think we need to rethink political ontology and how we analyze and classify and define and assess political parties and go beyond discourse, go beyond this kind of social constructivism and look at what what these parties actually do in terms of economic, socio-economic policy making. And finally, I know it covers a lot of the heterogeneous terrain here. Finally, to problematize the very term populism. As you saw, I qualified it throughout my presentation with a far-right populism. I think far-right is the key defining feature of these parties rather than populism, which is inaccurate. I don't think it captures the essence of what these parties are and stand for. And I think it's normatively loaded as well. Not the least because it can be used by the liberal center to conflate in a kind of horseshoe theory, conflate challenges from the left and the right, the neoliberal center, and class them as populist with one big label. So I think this is another thing that a materialist term can help us problematize. Sorry if I went for too long. Thank you so much for your attention.